Welcome to the study of the Long Scroll, part 3. How are you today, Sophia?
I'm doing well. How are you, Dave?
Quite good. Let's start out with a couple of aphorisms that will help us understand this section of the Long Scroll and its content. There's a saying amongst practitioners that a practitioner allows themselves to be stung by the scorpion over and over, and willingly does so, and in fact invites the sting of the scorpion. What does this mean? Well, scorpion has a toxic venom, and that toxic venom is analogous to the grasping that takes place in conventional association, where you grasp after what it is that you like experientially and grasp after getting away from what you don't like experientially. The point of practice, the main point of practice, being immersed in the habit field, is the ability to transmute that poison of grasping into the nectar of non-grasping, into the nectar of non-duality. So unlike some systems, in particular monastic systems, that seek to get away from the world's flux and flow and abstain from, for example, behaviors that induce the passions, a practitioner of the type that I represent runs towards those passions and immerses themselves in sensation, which does not mean that you immerse yourself in the acquisition of experience. You invite the sting of the scorpion so that the alchemical process of transmutation has fuel. This is very, very important. That's the first aphorism we're going to consider. The second aphorism that we're going to consider is another saying that is common amongst practitioners, that conventional diluted association has no beginning, but it has an end. And gnosis has a beginning, but has no end. This is very important because what it addresses is the fact that this activity, which is the meat of what happens in alchemical transformation, like we're talking about with the scorpion, is a primordial affair, a primordial consideration. You are considering the primordial. So if you look at the screen, you're going to see that there are two ways to categorize reality. One that is the conventional assumption, and the other is the application of the Gnostic non-dual view to that same scenario. The error that we sustain with the continual parade of grasping at experience is based on what we call the hyuli. The hyuli is just a way of approaching the ground of phenomena from the ordinary point of view. The ordinary point of view takes reality as if it were made of stuff. In other words, the ordinary point of view has a beginningless set of assumptions which underscore its habits, that assume that the things of the world and even the space of the world, even the space of the very appearance of the world, is a something, is a kind of a proto-substance. And when you grasp after that substance, in other words, when you consider it substantial, you reify it. And when you reify it, obviously, there is a reification of that which knows it. The subject is reified by the act, and the object is reified by the act, as we've said in previous videos. This creates a kind of opacity, a thingness for reality itself. And this relates directly to the scenario that we spoke about last time in part 2 with the Tzimtzum. If you hold the divine light as a something, if you reify the divine light, then the metaphor of the Tzimtzum becomes a conventional mechanical process that from the central point out to the sides of the circle, the divine light, which if it's grasped after as being a something, or if it's reified, can be pulled back and extracted, creating a vacated space. Meaning, if you reify the divine light, there is something to pull back and contract. The word Tzimtzum actually means contraction. So there is a word for the consideration of the ground as a something, as a reified entity, as a proto-substance, and it's called Hayuli, right? If this assumption exists, we can make a series of conclusions about it. If you reify the first substance, the primary substance, the proto-substance, obviously you're going to reify everything else. So this is the primordial basis of reification. This is a way of addressing the habit that you did not choose. It was born into you by virtue of the species behavior and association of the human realm. Human beings are born into it and do not choose it. They're automatically adapted to it the way that animals in nature are adapted to their species behavior by instinct. So the consideration of the Hayuli is a way of addressing the error of reification, which produces existential opacity. And that is the basis of all grasping. Any questions or statements about that, Sophia?
Your first statement brings to mind something you said to me once about the tantric path that you've spoken about before, the Vajrayana approach versus the Mahayana approach. And I think you categorized it as maximalist versus minimalist, or we might have been talking about Zen, where this maximalist immersion in phenomena is this distinct separate path from the sort of minimalist Zen paring down approach. And that's just something that I found that very helpful, to think that you're immersing in phenomena and using it as the scorpion sting, as the path itself, versus trying to, taking the monastic route and trying to get away from everything that could be categorized as passionate phenomena.
Well, let's talk about it in terms that Western practitioners will be able to relate to directly. We see a distinction here between quietist forms of meditation and contemplation, and the quietist forms are, in the sense that you're talking about it, tend to be minimalist, an emptying out of sensation and phenomena to reach a base state. That's one model. The other model that you're referring to as maximalist is the alchemical approach. It's the invitation to the scorpion for its sting. It's the invitation to consume the poison of grasping. Come on, lay it on me, and I'll do something with it. We're not avoiding anything, which means we're not avoiding our errors. We're not avoiding our fears. We're not avoiding the overflow of the toxicity of the realm itself. We're participating in whatever arises. And within that, we're doing our alchemical work. So it's maximalist by virtue of the fact that it eliminates or runs from nothing. It is literally a fearless approach, right? And this includes the horror and suffering of the world and one's pain, right? So one gaping hole in the processes that I see described within Western occultism, and in particular, people who technically concentrate on the grimoire condition, is they don't seem to be addressing their own suffering. They don't seem to be addressing the nature of the downfall of the human mind into a pit of despair, which is the inevitable consequence of sickness, old age, and death.
Right. Well, they don't seem to be addressing fundamental questions at all. It's very much externally focused. I'm going to do these rituals and I'm going to court these entities and they're going to fix my life for me, or they're going to grant me wisdom, or whatever it is. It's very this outward focused mechanical operation that doesn't really seek to address these these baseline questions of, well, why am I suffering to begin with, and what is the me that's suffering, and so on.
Yeah, I would say that that is true for the worst of them. However, the best of them do have spiritual practices and are interested in gnosis and essentially have a mystical component to their practice. I've seen people with both. It's when the mechanical aspect predominates that you run into the former situation. The latter situation, coming from an interest in gnosis, as either an integrated or separate activity. So what is that, right? Well, next to the term Hayuli on the right-hand side, on the other side of the crown, and of course the crown here represents Keter, as we've said last week, is another term. The term is Avira. Avira is another term for the Or Ein Sof, the openness, luminosity, the openness, fullness of the ground, if it's properly understood. However, the word Avira, which is used in both the Fountain of Wisdom and the Zohar, it's one of those rare instances where the Fountain of Wisdom and the Zohar actually agree on something. The word Avira denotes both the aspect of the primordial openness and the aspect of the primordial luminosity. So the way that I explain the Avira, which is a sort of a fuller, more comprehensive way of addressing the ground, I just call it the natural effulgence, the openness, fullness, the overflow of the light that never leaves its primordial expanse. So if you view, getting back to the original model of the Tzimtzum, if you view the divine light in the Tzimtzum process as dealing with the Avira and not the Hayuli, it changes the entire way that the metaphor functions in your mind. If you view the Or Ein Sof as a proto-substance, as a something, then the extraction from the vacated space of the Tzimtzum and the reintroduction of the light is literally a mechanical process. If you hold the ground as Hayuli, you take that metaphor literally as a history, a proto-history, a cosmic history. But if you take it as Avira, you realize that it has no substance. There is nothing there to grasp at. So there's nothing there to extract. There's nothing there to take away or put back. That these metaphors of negative and positive and giving and taking, these are metaphors for something that the mind does. And it is not a comment on any kind of divine thingness, right? So the difference between Hayuli and Avira marks the actual difference between views that become conventional or Gnostic. But they address that issue in the primordial sense. It's the perfect way to follow up on everything we said last week about the Tzimtzum. Make sense so far?
Yeah, and I just want to comment that when I first started talking to you and you used the word appearance to denote these apparent fluctuations of matter and reality, and I found that extremely helpful, because it really drives home the point you just made, that these things are not actually contracting and expanding and following these mechanical processes. We just think that they are, because that's a reflection of the mind's habits. So matter appears to do all of these things and appears to be separate, but it's not really the case. And so seeing reality as the appearance field was really a helpful turning point for me.
Yeah, well, everybody contends with the appearance field, but the appearance field can be either one. It could be either held as Hayuli, meaning it could be reified, or it could be held as a vira, the natural effulgence of Ensof. It still appears, and it still appears the same way. Like you could, a person with some Gnostic realization can sit next to a person who is perceiving conceptually, and you could both agree that a certain scenario is appearing in front of you. Here we are on the beach, we're looking at the sky, the waves are breaking on the shore. We're having what is described in a general sense as the same phenomena. However, the meaning of that phenomena on a specific individual level couldn't be more different. So this highlights what we're going to talk about maybe in the next video after this one, which is the difference between general and specific phenomena, where they overlap and where they differ. And the reason why that's important is because that's where this distinction between the Hayuli and the Avira is applied. If you want to read about this, I wrote a bit about it in my first Lightning Flash of Olive book, Deep Principles of Kabbalistic Alchemy. Okay, so moving forward, if you hold the ground in a reified manner as a proto-substance, if you hold the ground as Hayuli, there's an interesting phenomena that is described in the Kabbalistic literature that takes place. Going back to the Tzimtzum model, there was a point. The point contracted to the sides, leaving a vacated space for light to be introduced in steps and stages. If you take that literally as something that happened mechanically, then the Kabbalistic text tells you that there is a byproduct of this process called the Rashimu. Rashimu means residue. In other words, the extraction of the divine light left something of itself behind. And it's described as a kind of aroma. It's like you cook your French toast and you eat your French toast in the morning, and then you go back down to the kitchen and it still smells like French toast, right? It is a word that pertains directly to reification, because if something can be left behind, you have an indication that there was a something. The aromas can remain and be dealt with, but if they're fundamentally the same as that which is extracted, if they're treated as an open transparency, the concept of residue becomes vastly different to the mind. When you're dealing with the reification of the ground as Hayuli, the Rashimu, the residue that's left behind, is the basis of all future errors. In other words, there was a something, it was extracted, and now there is a nothing. That means that both something and nothing are being reified as concepts. The residue is where they bleed together. And this is where all the degrees of conceptuality, of associative designation are formed. They're formed within the ghost of the residue of something that never happened. They're formed from the residue of that which was neither a positive nor a negative, but you're taking it as both. You're taking it as a binary system. In other words, duality is composed from the residue of a ghost that you're chasing, that never, ever was what you thought it was. In our world, we think things are real, and the absence of things we think are unreal. We have a binary or dualistic sense of attachment to being and non-being. That is formed from the residue of a primordial error. And that error is the error of the Hayuli. So when we go on to discuss the bulk of what we're going to talk about today, which is the formation of klipas, klipas are formed from a certain conceptual impulse. And that impulse is rooted in the Rashimu of the Halal Apanui, the vacated space, the Rashimu or residue of the Hayuli. And this is something that's very important for us to understand, because that residue has a certain stickiness to it. In other words, the stickiness that I'm talking about is the propensity to lead the mind into attachment and grasping. That's what I mean by stickiness. that there is a certain sense that in order for something to be known, we have to attach to it. We have to attach to it as if it were a something. In other words, we have to reify both ourselves as the subject that knows and the object that we're trying to attach to as that which becomes known. That's the stickiness of the residue that we're talking about here. Now, by contrast, if you were to not reify the ground, you could understand that the Tzimtzum scenario, the introduction and the subtraction of divine light, is just a metaphor for an ethereal quality of openness, fullness that neither is nor is not. In other words, you could correctly understand the wisdom nature that doesn't change regardless of whether you put something in or take something out. That's the metaphor, right? This is a huge distinction. This distinction that I'm talking about here underscores the entire discussion of view and how it's applied. And it uses the primordial Tzimtzum model as a way of doing it. Because like I said, delusion doesn't have a beginning. We entered onto the scene doing this, but it has an end. It stops when you stop doing it. And that's when gnosis starts. And gnosis goes on forever.
It's amazing that you could describe the path as not doing something, but stopping doing something.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of the crux of the situation is we're doing all these things and learning all this information so that we can stop doing something that we just didn't have a choice to begin doing. And so it sounds to me like the Rashimu is the momentum of habit of the human realm to make this error. Would that be correct?
That's absolutely right. And the amazing thing is that that's actually what the Lurianic texts suggest. However, the Lurianic texts don't tell you that this is a metaphor. They state it as if it were a proto-cosmic history. This happened. The light was extracted. It left a residue. That residue ultimately became the sparks embedded within the forms of the worlds that arose once worlds were created and destroyed, and the light fell into and through itself and then was reintroduced in steps and stages, right? So there's this long drawn out process, but the residue is always in the vacated space of the Tzimtzum circle. And as the worlds are created, there's hidden primordial sparks there, and we're trying to raise them up. So that's that's a metaphor for what we're doing. The Kabbalistic texts are not lying. That's a good metaphor, but it's on us.
It is. And you can see where all of this sort of spirit and matter dichotomy that you see so much in these heavy-handed mortification of the flesh cults that everyone likes to decry, especially here in the West. I mean, this is like the root of that error, and where you get these religious traditions that insist that the world is dirty and bad, and there's this wonderful God out there, and if we could just reach him and receive his light, we could stop being so dirty and bad. And it begins in this tiny little kernel of mistaking the world for being somehow separate from yourself to begin with, and separate from the divine.
Right. That's the essence of duality right there.
Yeah.
You just said. Now, I have a theory about something. I mean, the question is, if this elaborate metaphor is being suggested by the Lurianic texts and the Kabbalistic texts and the Zohar itself, why don't they just tell you about the error of reification? Why don't they just describe it and say, don't reify the nature of phenomena? Why not? Well, I have a theory about that. And the theory is that they've got one foot in mystical gnosis and the other foot in exoteric religion. And they're not going to tell you not to reify, because then they are suggesting that you don't attach to God. Because ultimately, the systems themselves are unsure about the reification of God. And since I'm dealing with a non-theistic view, and I view the reification of a divine persona in error that is just as conceptual as any other conceptual error, I can say it. I could say dismiss reification wholesale, but I think that religiously based Kabbalistic systems approach that issue with a great deal of trepidation. It is unclear whether reifying God is a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah, and when you told me to read Arya Kaplan, I mean, it came with so many caveats about him as being steeped in this in Orthodox Judaism and this religious tradition, and he couldn't just, he was a public figure, he couldn't just come out and say, no, there's no God as you understand him, you know, stop doing that. It would have been far too explosive and scandalous. And I really think that there's this fundamental fear that there is no, you know, that we don't know how to relate at a personal level to an abstraction, right? You know, that this is why we create these figures to like Jesus or God or whatever it is to sort of pour that religious impulse into, and it becomes a psychological, emotional artifact when we do that. But it's, you know, I have a lot of sympathy for people who tend toward that, because it's a terrifying thought to think, no, there is no big daddy, there is no you know, thing called whatever that's going to reach out and help you. And you know, it would be like being tossed through space. You know, that's why this whole genre of space horror films exists. Like, it's one of the most terrifying things to think of, just tumbling through space without anything to cling on to. And that, but that's exactly what we're asking ourselves to do with a system like this.
Yes, it's true. However, there is a transition, right? And that's what I was intending when I mentioned the statement that the practitioner allows themselves to be stung by the scorpion over and over. This is the interesting place where we got to bring that back. Let's face reality. As we are students and practitioners on the path, we're going to reify something. We can't just stop. So the path gives us something to reify, to work on, to practice the alchemical transformation of dealing with that phenomena from ordinary grasping and reification, in other words, turning it into the Hayuli, to turning it into something else, that being the Avira, that being living through the view. But it doesn't happen overnight. There's a gradual transformation that happens. So just like you said, where you have symbols that become concrete for the path, there is a need for those. And technically, that need is substantiated by the fact that they lead you into subtler and subtler forms of engagement. Ultimately, that they're not ordinary things. They're things that bear the momentum of the path itself. So what the practitioner does from an alchemical or transmutational perspective is we acknowledge, yes, we're going to reify something. So we reify phenomena from the point of view of the path. We take the poison into ourselves and get as much teaching as we can and understanding as we can to understand that that poison is not what we think it is. So we learn to not succumb to its toxic effects and gradually take that same dynamism and realize its inherent, inborn, innate nature, which is the nectar of the natural effulgence, the Avira. We don't actually have to change anything into anything else. We simply just change the view of that which we are already doing, right? This is the thing about the form of alchemy that I'm suggesting. Nothing is taken out, nothing is put in. It appears that something is. And in a sense, you could say that something is taken out. Those are your habits. But what are they made of? They're not made of anything. Your habits have no substance. They don't really, truly exist. Try to put your finger on them, right? They're completely elusive. So when the habits dissolve, it was like nothing dissolved. right?
Yeah, it's like this, to keep following the metaphor, it sounds like what you're asking us to do is to be stung so many times that you become inoculated to the
Yeah,
poison.
the
And
vaccine.
yeah, um, but I also want to bring up the metaphor of the mercury, you know, because you use that in your system and in alchemical systems more broadly as this perfect metaphor for, you know, in the physical world, it's this toxic substance. And in the symbolic language here, it is the thing, it's this dynamic, luminous, you know, fluidity that creates appearances for us. So it's this sort of perfect poison metaphor.
Yeah, the latter natural effulgent purity that you're talking about, I refer to as the secret mercury, and the flux and flow of ordinary phenomena, which is of course reified at its base, is just ordinary mercury. It's all mercury. The question is, are you viewing the mercury in a pure way, in a pure manner, with pure vision, or is it being exchanged by a subject and its objects? Thank you very much for the study of the long scroll and so on and so forth today with part 3.